The small town of Pine Creek wasn't known for much. It had one high school, 3 churches, and Fuller's Family Market, the supermarket that had been serving local families for over 50 years. What made this store special wasn't its wide selection of products or the competitive prices. It was Jake Thompson. Jake was 25 years old with Down syndrome and a smile that could light up the darkest day. Every morning at exactly 7:45 a.m., he would arrive at the employee entrance, his lunch packed neatly in a blue container by his mom. He always wore his green Fuller's apron with pride, making sure it was perfectly straight before stepping onto the shop floor. "Good morning. Welcome to Fuller's," Jake would call out to the first customers of the day. His voice carried a warmth that made even the grumpiest morning shoppers crack a smile. Jake had been working at Fuller's for 3 years now, and in that time, he had never missed a single day of work. The produce section was Jake's kingdom. He took his job more seriously than anyone else in the store. Each apple had to face the same way, showing its best side. The carrots needed to be sprayed with just the right amount of water to keep them looking fresh. And heaven help anyone who mixed the red and green peppers in the same bin. "Attention to detail," Jake would say, pointing to his eyes and then to the vegetables. It was something his dad had taught him, and Jake never forgot it. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came to buy just a few items every day as an excuse to talk to people, always made a point to visit Jake's section. "How are the strawberries today, Jake?" she would ask, knowing full well what his answer would be. "The best in town, Mrs. Chen." "I picked them out myself," Jake would beam, even though the strawberries came from the same supplier every week. But somehow, when Jake said they were the best, they really did taste better. The high school kids who worked part-time at Fuller's all looked up to Jake. He knew where everything was, could work the register in half the time it took them, and never got flustered during the busy holiday rushes. When new employees started, it was often Jake who showed them the ropes. "Take your time," he would tell them. "Getting it right is more important than getting it fast." Jake's supervisor, Tom, often said he wished he could bottle Jake's work ethic and sell it. On Thursdays, Jake was in charge of the free sample table. He would carefully arrange small cups of whatever was on special that week. His favorite was when they sampled the local honey from Riverside Farms. He'd tell customers about how the bees pollinated the apple orchards just outside of town and how the honey tasted different depending on which flowers the bees visited. Jake's parents, Bill and Nancy, would sometimes stop by during his shifts. They'd pretend to shop, but everyone knew they just wanted to see their son in his element. The pride in Bill's eyes was unmistakable as he watched Jake help an elderly gentleman reach a box of cereal from the top shelf. "That's my boy," he'd whisper to Nancy, who would squeeze his hand in response. Fuller's wasn't just a job to Jake, it was where he belonged. The regular customers knew him by name, and he knew their usual purchases. "Don't forget your favorite cookies," he'd remind Mr. Wilson, who pretended he was cutting back on sweets, but always gave in when Jake mentioned them. At the end of each day, Jake would carefully count his register, never making a mistake. He'd clean his area until it shined, and then he'd walk through the produce section one last time, making sure everything was perfect for tomorrow's customers. As Jake waited at the bus stop after work, he'd often replay the day's events in his head. The conversations he had, the new products he'd stocked, the smiles he'd exchanged with customers. In a world that wasn't always kind to people who were different, Fuller's Family Market had given Jake something precious, a place where he was valued not despite his differences, but because of the unique perspective and joy he brought to every interaction. Little did Jake know that his world at Fuller's was about to be shaken to its core, and that the place he loved so dearly would become the setting for both his greatest hurt and his most meaningful triumph. Friday morning at Fuller's Family Market started like any other day. The delivery trucks arrived before dawn, the bakery filled the store with the smell of fresh bread, and the early shift employees prepared for opening. But there was one key difference. David Fuller had arrived earlier than usual, and he had spent the first hour of the day meeting with his staff. "I want to be clear about our priorities," he told the team gathered in the break room. "Fuller's has always been more than just a place to buy groceries. My grandfather believed that a business is only as good as how it treats people, both customers and employees." He explained the new policy he drafted overnight. From today forward, Fuller's has zero tolerance for disrespect toward any staff member. If a customer is rude or abusive, you have my full permission to politely end the interaction and call the manager. No one at Fuller's should ever have to endure what Jake experienced. The staff nodded in agreement, many of them still upset about Saturday's incident. After the meeting, David had Tom help him create a simple but prominent sign for each entrance. At Fuller's Family Market, we respect everyone. We ask that our customers do the same. By mid-morning, David was in his office handling paperwork when Tom knocked on his door. "She's here," Tom said quietly. David looked up. "Miranda Wells?" Tom nodded. "Just pulled into the parking lot. Silver Lexus, just like before." David stood up and straightened his tie. "I'll handle this." Miranda Wells entered Fuller's with the same air of impatience she'd shown on her previous visit. Her designer handbag hung from one arm, her phone clutched in her hand. She grabbed a basket and began moving efficiently through the aisles, barely glancing at other shoppers. She was comparing two brands of pasta when David approached her. With his neatly pressed shirt and friendly smile, he looked like any other helpful store manager. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I don't believe we've met. I'm David Fuller, the owner." Miranda glanced up, momentarily surprised by the personal introduction. "Oh, hello. I understand you had an unfortunate experience here last Saturday," David continued, maintaining his friendly tone. Miranda's expression shifted as she realized this wasn't a casual greeting. "Yes, I did. One of your employees was extremely careless with my groceries." "That would be Jake Thompson," David said, his smile unchanged but his eyes more focused. "He's been with us for 3 years. One of our most dedicated employees, actually." Miranda placed the pasta in her basket and began to move away. "Well, you should be more careful. My time is valuable, and I don't appreciate incompetence." David stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her path but making it clear the conversation wasn't over. "Actually, Ms. Wells, it is Ms. Wells, correct? I'd like to have a word with you about that incident. Could we step over to the customer service desk? It's a bit more private." Something in his tone made Miranda hesitate. She looked around, noticing for the first time that several shoppers were watching them with undisguised interest. "Fine," she said shortly, "but I don't have much time." At the customer service desk, away from the main aisles, David's demeanor changed subtly. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Ms. Wells, I've owned this store for 10 years, and in that time, I've dealt with all kinds of customer complaints. Some justified, some not. But what happened on Saturday wasn't a complaint, it was an attack on someone who has earned the respect of this entire community." Miranda crossed her arms defensively. "I simply expressed my frustration at poor service." "No," David said firmly, "you publicly humiliated a person for having Down syndrome. You suggested he shouldn't have a job because of who he is." "I never said. You said, and I quote, 'This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be working here.'" David's voice remained quiet but carried an unmistakable edge. "We have 6 witnesses who heard you say those exact words, including 2 of my staff members." Miranda's cheeks flushed pink. "Look, I may have been a bit harsh, but—" "Jake hasn't been back to work since that day," David continued. "A young man who never missed a day in 3 years has been too afraid to come back to the job he loves because of how you treated him." For the first time, a flicker of discomfort crossed Miranda's face. She glanced around, noticing that the customer service area had become unusually quiet, with several people openly watching their conversation. "What do you want from me?" she asked, lowering her voice. "An apology? Fine, I'm sorry if I offended him." David shook his head slowly. "Ms. Wells, I've spent the morning thinking about how to handle this situation. Fuller's welcomes everyone. That's been our policy since my grandfather opened this store. But welcoming everyone doesn't mean tolerating behavior that hurts our Fuller's family." He gestured to the bulletin board nearby, now covered with notes for Jake. "These are from customers who know Jake's true value. People who understand that worth isn't measured by how quickly you bag groceries, but by how you treat others." Miranda's eyes darted to the board, then back to David. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm prepared to refund the cost of your groceries from Saturday, including the olive oil and eggs," David said calmly. "And then I'm going to suggest that you might be more comfortable shopping elsewhere in the future." Miranda's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you? Are you banning me from your store? I'm suggesting that our values don't align with yours, David replied. Fuller's operates on a principle of mutual respect. If that doesn't work for you, there's a big chain supermarket about 15 minutes away. I hear their checkout lines move very quickly. This is ridiculous, Miranda sputtered. You can't run a business this way. The customer is always right. David smiled, but his eyes remained serious. That's where you're wrong, Ms. Wells. That saying has been misunderstood for years. The original meaning was the customer is always right in matters of taste, not that customers can behave however they want without consequences. He leaned forward slightly. My first responsibility isn't to every person who walks through that door, it's to protect the dignity of every person who works here. People like Jake. Miranda stood frozen for a moment, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Around them, the usual sounds of the supermarket, beeping scanners, squeaking cartwheels, quiet conversations, seemed to have faded away. Keep your refund, she finally said, setting her basket on the counter with a thud. I wouldn't shop in this backwater market again if you paid me. As she turned to leave, David called after her, his voice quiet but clear enough for those nearby to hear. Ms. Wells? She paused but didn't turn around. Jake will be back at work on Monday. If you ever change your mind about how you see people, he'll probably be the first to forgive you. That's the kind of person he is. Miranda's shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing as she walked out the door, the little bell above it jingling cheerfully in stark contrast to the tension of the moment. As the door closed behind her, a smattering of applause broke out from the customers who had witnessed the exchange. David raised his hands to quiet them, suddenly embarrassed by the attention. All right, folks, show's over, he said good-naturedly. We've got a store to run here. But as David walked back to his office, he noticed Tom watching him with a grin. What? David asked. Nothing, Tom replied. Just thinking your grandfather would be proud of what you did today. David nodded, feeling the weight of the confrontation lifting from his shoulders. Let's hope Jake feels the same way. Now we just need to make sure he comes back on Monday. What David didn't know was that the Pine Creek grapevine was already at work. By sunset, everyone in town would know exactly what had happened at Fuller's family market that morning, including the Thompson household. It was one of those Saturdays that kept the staff at Fuller's family market on their toes. The kind where it seemed like the entire town had decided to shop at the exact same time. The parking lot was packed, shopping carts zigzagged through crowded aisles, and the checkout lines stretched almost to the back of the store. Jake had been on his feet since opening, but his enthusiasm hadn't dimmed one bit. While other employees showed signs of fatigue, slumped shoulders, tired sighs, glances at the clock, Jake moved with the same careful purpose he always did. Today he was helping with bagging at Register 3, his hands working steadily as he organized each customer's groceries. Cans on the bottom, bread on top, he reminded himself quietly, following the system he'd perfected over the years. The afternoon sun streamed through the front windows, creating a warm glow over the busy store. The sound of beeping scanners, rattling carts, and casual conversation filled the air. It was the normal weekend rush at Fuller's, until it wasn't. A sleek, silver luxury car pulled into a spot near the entrance. Out stepped Miranda Wells, who had moved to Pine Creek just 2 weeks ago. Her designer sunglasses perched on her head, pushing back perfectly highlighted hair. She wore the kind of outfit that seemed too fancy for grocery shopping, and her high heels clicked sharply against the floor as she entered. This was Miranda's first time at Fuller's. She usually drove to the big chain supermarket in the next town over, but she'd run out of a few essentials and decided to give the local place a try. From the moment she walked in, her phone never left her hand. She pushed her cart one-handed, occasionally bumping into displays as she scrolled through messages, barely looking up to select items from the shelves. When Miranda finally made her way to the checkout area, the lines were at their peak. She let out an audible huff, checking her watch and tapping her foot impatiently. After scanning the options, she picked Jake's line, assuming it might move faster since there were only 3 people ahead of her. But the customer at the register was an elderly man paying with exact change, counting out pennies one by one with shaking hands. The cashier, a high school student named Lily, waited patiently. Miranda wasn't so understanding. She sighed loudly, making sure everyone around her knew of her displeasure. When it was finally Miranda's turn, she practically threw her items onto the conveyor belt. Lily tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor despite Miranda's obvious irritation. "Did you find everything okay today?" Lily asked. "If I hadn't, I wouldn't be in line, would I?" Miranda replied curtly, not looking up from her phone. Jake, who had just finished bagging for the previous customer, moved over to Miranda's groceries. He was careful and methodical, sorting her items by category as he always did. "Paper or plastic?" he asked with a smile. Miranda glanced up, noticing Jake for the first time. Her expression changed subtly as she registered his features, the characteristic signs of Down syndrome that made Jake who he was. "Plastic," she said shortly, returning to her phone call. Jake nodded and began bagging her groceries. He was particularly careful with a carton of eggs, checking to make sure none were cracked before placing them in the bag. "Ma'am, your eggs are good," he said proudly, holding them up to show her he had checked. Miranda ignored him, tapping her credit card impatiently against the counter as she waited for Lily to finish scanning. The trouble began when Jake reached for a bottle of expensive olive oil. His hands, slightly less coordinated than others, fumbled for just a moment. The bottle slipped from his grasp, knocking into the carton of eggs he had so carefully checked. Both items tumbled into the bag, and the unmistakable sound of cracking eggshells filled the sudden silence. Jake's face fell. "I'm sorry, I'll get new eggs," he said immediately, already reaching to remove the damaged carton. But Miranda's patience had run out. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice rising well above the normal chatter of the store. "This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be working here." The entire checkout area went quiet. Customers froze, conversations halted mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward Register 3. "I don't have time for this incompetence," Miranda continued, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "Do you have any idea how much that oil cost? And now there's egg all over it." Jake stood motionless, the broken carton still in his hands, as the yolk dripped slowly onto his carefully polished shoes. The store seemed frozen in time. Customers stood with their mouths half open, cashiers paused mid-scan, and even the usual beeping of the registers seemed to have gone silent. Jake stood there, egg yolk dripping between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the floor. The bright smile that was his trademark had vanished completely. Lily, the young cashier, was the first to break the spell. "Ma'am, there's no need to speak to our staff that way," she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "Jake is one of our best employees." Miranda rolled her eyes. "Well, your best employee just ruined my groceries." She gestured at the bag where the olive oil bottle was now streaked with egg white. "I expect a full refund and a new bottle." An older gentleman waiting in line behind Miranda cleared his throat loudly. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his 70-plus years, "where I come from, we treat people with respect." Miranda's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't back down. "I respect competence," she shot back. "I'm a busy woman, and I don't have time for mistakes." By now Tom, the floor supervisor, had hurried over. He was a kind man in his 40s who had taken Jake under his wing from day one. "I'll handle this," he told Lily quietly. Then, turning to Miranda with his best customer service smile, "I apologize for any inconvenience. We'll replace your eggs and the oil at no charge." While Tom dealt with Miranda, Jake had quietly set down the broken egg carton and untied his apron. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely manage the knot. Without making eye contact with anyone, he slipped away from the register and headed toward the back room. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed everything from the nearby deli counter, reached out to touch his arm as he passed. "Jake, sweetheart, don't you listen to that woman," she said gently. But Jake didn't respond. He just kept walking, his shoulders hunched forward as if he were trying to make himself smaller, less visible. In the employee break room, Jake sat alone at the table. His hands still had traces of egg on them, but he didn't seem to notice. He rocked slightly back and forth, a self-soothing motion he hadn't needed to use at work in a very long time. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room. I'm sorry." 10 minutes later, Tom found him there, still repeating those same two words. He sat down beside Jake without speaking, simply offering his presence. After a few moments, he placed a damp paper towel in Jake's hands. "You've got a bit of egg there, buddy," Tom said gently. Jake looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He wiped them slowly, methodically, the same way he did everything. "I'd like to go home now," Jake said finally, his voice so quiet Tom had to lean in to hear him. "The day's almost over anyway," Tom said. "I'll call your mom to pick you up." While they waited for Jake's mother to arrive, Tom tried to reassure him. "That woman was way out of line, Jake. Nobody blames you for what happened." But Jake just stared at his clean hands. "She said people like me shouldn't work yet," he said. What did she mean, people like me? Tom felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain the cruelty of prejudice to someone whose heart had no room for such darkness? "Some people just don't understand that everyone has different strengths," Tom said carefully. "But we do. That's why you're part of our team." When Nancy Thompson arrived to pick up her son, she knew immediately something was wrong. Jake, who usually bounded to the car full of stories about his day, walked slowly across the parking lot with his head down. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Nancy asked, her hand instinctively reaching for his. Tom had given her a brief explanation over the phone, but nothing prepared her for the pain in her son's eyes when he finally looked at her. "I don't want to come back tomorrow," Jake said. The next morning, for the first time in 3 years, Jake's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., and he didn't get up. When Nancy gently reminded him it was time for work, he pulled the covers over his head. "I don't feel good," he said. "My stomach hurts." Nancy knew her son well enough to recognize that his ailment wasn't physical. Still, she called the store to let them know Jake wouldn't be in. The following day was the same, and the next. Jake, who had once counted down the minutes until his shift started, now invented reasons to stay home. A headache, a sore throat, a mysterious pain in his leg. On the 4th day, Nancy sat on the edge of his bed. "Jake, honey, are you sure you don't want to go back to Fuller's? I know Tom and everyone there misses you." Jake turned away from her, facing the wall where his Fuller's Employee of the Month certificate hung. "What if I mess up again?" he asked, his voice small. "What if she comes back?" Monday mornings at Fuller's Family Market were typically quiet. Most folks did their big shopping on weekends, leaving Mondays for the retirees who preferred avoiding crowds and the occasional parent grabbing a forgotten lunch item for their kids. But this Monday was different. By 7:30 a.m., a small group had already gathered in the parking lot. Mrs. Chen was there, her gray hair neatly pinned back, holding a thermos of tea. Mr. Wilson stood nearby, checking his watch every few minutes. Tom had arrived early to put up streamers near the employee entrance, and Lily was inflating colorful balloons with a small hand pump. "Is this too much?" Tom asked, stepping back to survey their work. "We don't want to overwhelm him." "It's perfect," Lily assured him. Jake loves celebrations. Inside the store, David Fuller was making final preparations. The bulletin board had been moved to a more prominent location near the entrance, still covered with the notes and cards from well-wishers. Beside it stood a new, professionally printed sign. "At Fuller's, we believe everyone deserves respect and dignity. Thank you for helping us maintain a kind and inclusive environment." At 7:43 a.m., a blue minivan pulled into the parking lot. Nancy Thompson was driving, with Jake in the passenger seat. They sat there for a moment, Nancy's hand resting reassuringly on her son's arm. "Remember what we talked about," she said gently. "If it gets too much, you just tell Mr. Fuller you need a break." Jake nodded, his hands fidgeting with the straps of his lunchbox. He was wearing his Fuller's uniform, freshly washed and ironed. His name tag was pinned precisely over his heart. "What if I make another mistake?" he asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake much of the night. "Everyone makes mistakes, honey," Nancy reminded him. "What matters is how we handle them." Jake took a deep breath and opened the car door. As he stepped out, the small gathering broke into applause. Jake froze, his eyes widening as he took in the streamers, the balloons, and the familiar faces all smiling at him. "Welcome back, Jake," Mrs. Chen called, hurrying forward to press the thermos into his hands. "I made your favorite ginger tea." Mr. Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "The produce section's been a mess without you, son. Nobody arranges those apples quite like you do." Jake looked from face to face, his expression shifting from surprise to tentative happiness. You all came just for me." "Of course we did," Lally said, handing him a balloon. "Fuller's isn't the same without you." Tom stepped forward. "Ready to get back to work, buddy? We've got some special plans today." As they led Jake toward the entrance, the small crowd parted to reveal David Fuller waiting at the door. He extended his hand formally, as if greeting a visiting dignitary rather than an employee. "Jake, on behalf of Fuller's Family Market, welcome back," David said warmly. "We've missed you." Jake shook his hand, standing a little straighter. "Thank you, Mr. Fuller. I'm ready to work hard today." Inside, more surprises awaited. The break room had been decorated with a "Welcome Back, Jake" banner. A sheet cake sat on the table, decorated with an expertly frosted produce section, complete with tiny fondant apples and carrots. "We'll have cake at lunch," David promised. "But first, I'd like to show you something." He led Jake to the front of the store, where a new display had been set up near the customer service desk. It was a employee spotlight board with Jake's photo in the center. "Each month we're going to feature a different team member," David explained. "And we wanted to start with you. Would you like to read what it says?" Jake stepped closer, adjusting his glasses to read the text beneath his photo. "Jake Thompson has been part of the Fuller's family for 3 years. His attention to detail in the produce section ensures our customers get the freshest fruits and vegetables. Jake is known for his friendly greetings and his ability to remember customers' preferences. His favorite part of working at Fuller's is helping people find what makes them happy." Jake read it twice, his finger tracing under each word. "That's really about me?" he asked softly. "Every word," David confirmed. "And there's one more thing." He handed Jake a small envelope. Inside was a certificate naming him Employee of the Month, along with a gift card for the movie theater in town. As Jake looked at the certificate, the front door chimed. The first customers of the day were arriving, except they weren't just any customers. They were Jake's former teachers from high school, both beaming with pride. "We heard our favorite student was back at work," one called out. "We needed to do some shopping right away." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of people came through Fuller's. Some needed groceries, but many just stopped by to welcome Jake back. The local newspaper photographer came to take a picture for next week's edition. Even the mayor popped in, shaking Jake's hand and praising Fuller's new inclusivity policy. By lunchtime, Jake was tired but happy. As the team gathered in the break room for cake, Tom asked him how it felt to be back. "Good," Jake said simply. "This is where I belong." After lunch, as Jake was returning to the produce section, a young mother approached him. Her daughter, about 7 years old, partially hid behind her legs, peeking out shyly. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Jake?" Jake nodded, automatically straightening his name tag. "My daughter Lily has Down syndrome too," the woman explained gently. "When we heard what happened, and then how everyone stood up for you, I wanted her to meet you." She encouraged her daughter to step forward. "Lily, this is the man I told you about." The little girl looked up at Jake with curious eyes. "Do you like working here?" she asked in a small voice. Jake knelt down to her level. "I love it. I'm good at it too." "I want to work when I grow up," Lily declared. Jake smiled, his whole face lighting up. "You can do anything you want to. And when you're old enough, you can apply at Fuller's. I'll put in a good word for you." The girl's mother blinked back tears as she thanked Jake and moved on with their shopping. As Jake watched them go, he felt a new sense of purpose. What had happened with Miranda Wells still hurt when he thought about it, but something good had come from it too. The store felt different now, safer somehow. At the end of his shift, as Jake was hanging up his apron, David stopped by the break room. "How was your first day back?" he asked. "Busy," Jake said, in a good way. David nodded. "You know, Jake, when my grandfather started this store, he had a saying, 'A community is only as strong as how it treats its most vulnerable members.' For a long time, that was just words on a plaque in my office. But this past week, I've seen it in action." Jake considered this. "Because of what happened to me." "Because of how people responded to what happened to you," David corrected. "One person was unkind, but hundreds stood up to say that's not who we are in Pine Creek, that's something special." As Jake walked out to meet his mother in the parking lot, he passed the bulletin board still covered with notes of support. He stopped to read a few he hadn't noticed before. One caught his eye. a crayon drawing from a child showing a stick figure with a fuller's apron and a big smile. Underneath, in wobbly letters, Jake makes the store happy. Jake touched the drawing gently. Tomorrow he would come back again, and the next day too. There would always be people like Miranda in the world, but there would also be people like David Fuller, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Wilson, and all the others who had shown him that he belonged. In the weeks that followed, Fuller's Family Market became known throughout the region for more than just good prices and fresh produce. Schools began bringing students for field trips to learn about inclusive workplaces. 3 new employees with various disabilities were hired, each one mentored by Jake himself. The Employee Spotlight Board became a beloved feature, showcasing the diverse team that made Fuller's special. And the story of the day Jake Thompson returned to work became part of Pine Creek's history. A reminder that sometimes it takes just one person to stand up for what's right, to inspire an entire community to show its true character. Nancy didn't have an answer. How could she promise her son that the world wouldn't be cruel again? Instead, she sat with him in silence, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as the clock ticked past the time when Jake should have been arranging apples and greeting customers with the brightest smile in Pine Creek. Pine Creek wasn't the kind of town where secrets lasted long. By Sunday morning, nearly everyone had heard about what happened at Fuller's Family Market. The story spread from neighbor to neighbor, over fences, through church pews, and across tables at the local diner. The first few customers who came into Fuller's on Sunday immediately noticed Jake's absence. Jake, who had been a fixture at the store every weekend for 3 years, had never missed a Sunday shift before. "Where's Jake today?" asked Mr. Wilson as he collected his usual groceries. The elderly man had grown fond of the young man who always remembered his favorite cookies. Lily, working the register, hesitated before answering. "He's taking some time off." Mr. Wilson frowned. "Is he sick? That boy's never sick." "Not exactly," Lily said, lowering her voice. "There was an incident yesterday. A woman was really mean to him when he accidentally dropped some eggs." Mr. Wilson's face darkened. "What woman? Someone from town?" "No, somebody new. Drives a fancy silver car." That was all it took. Mr. Wilson left the store with his groceries and a mission. By lunchtime, he had spread the word to the regulars at the corner cafe, who passed it along to the Sunday crowd at Riverside Church, who told their neighbors, who shared it with their friends. Monday morning brought a steady stream of concerned customers to Fuller's, all asking about Jake. Mrs. Chen arrived with a hand-knitted scarf for him. "Tell him we miss his smile," she said, placing the carefully wrapped package on the customer service desk. By Tuesday afternoon, the store had received so many inquiries about Jake that Tom put up a small bulletin board near the entrance where people could leave notes for him. The board quickly filled with colorful cards and messages. "We miss you, Jake. The produce section isn't the same without you. Come back soon." Meanwhile, on social media, the conversation was heating up. Penny Howard, who ran the Pine Creek Community Matters Facebook page, posted about the incident after her daughter, who worked part-time at Fuller's, told her what had happened. "Our town has always prided itself on being a place where everyone belongs," she wrote. "I'm deeply troubled to hear about how one of our most beloved community members was treated. Jake Thompson has brightened countless shopping trips with his dedication and kindness. He deserves better." The post quickly gathered hundreds of comments and shares. Longtime residents recalled times when Jake had gone out of his way to help them, carrying groceries to cars in the rain, setting aside the freshest produce for elderly customers, memorizing the favorite items of regular shoppers. Bobby Fletcher, who had graduated high school with Jake, shared a memory. "When we were kids, some boys were picking on me because I was small for my age. Jake stepped between us and said, 'Be nice or go away.' That's who Jake is. Always has been." The online support soon translated into real-world action. On Wednesday, a group of local moms organized a Shop for Jake Day, encouraging people to visit Fuller's and leave positive messages about what Jake meant to the community. The store was busier than usual that day. Many customers wore handmade badges that read, "We stand with Jake." The bulletin board by the entrance had to be expanded to accommodate all the notes. Carol Winters, who taught special education at Pine Creek High School, brought her current students to the store. "I want them to see how valued Jake is," she explained to Tom. And I want them to understand that this community doesn't tolerate bullying, especially toward people with disabilities. The local newspaper, the Pine Creek Gazette, ran a front-page story titled "Community Rallies Around Beloved Market Employee." The article detailed Jake's contributions to Fuller's and the outpouring of support following the incident. "Jake Thompson may not realize it," the article concluded, "but he has taught this town more about dignity, work ethic, and genuine kindness than any formal education could provide." By Thursday evening, word reached the Thompson household about the community's response. Nancy sat on the edge of Jake's bed, showing him photos on her phone of the bulletin board covered in notes and the Shop for Jake event. "All these people miss you," she said gently. "They want you to come back." Jake studied the images, his fingers tracing the faces of familiar customers on the small screen. "They're not mad at me for dropping the eggs?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "No, sweetheart. They're mad at the woman who was unkind to you." For the first time in days, Jake's expression lightened slightly. "Can I see the notes they left?" Nancy nodded. "Tom said he's saving them all for you. He even bought a special box to keep them in." As Jake scrolled through the photos, something shifted in his demeanor. The slumped shoulders straightened a bit, the downcast eyes lifted. It wasn't quite his old confidence returning, but it was a start. "Maybe I could go back," he said slowly, "but not tomorrow. Maybe next week." Nancy hugged him, tears in her eyes. "Whenever you're ready, honey, the whole town will be waiting for you." What neither Jake nor the rest of Pine Creek knew was that the owner of Fuller's Family Market, David Fuller, had been away on a fishing trip in the mountains with no cell service. He was just now driving back into town, completely unaware of what had happened in his absence, and about to prove that sometimes the right person steps in at exactly the right time. David Fuller loved his annual fishing trip. 5 days in the mountains with no phone, no email, and no grocery store emergencies to handle. It was the only time all year when he completely disconnected from Fuller's Family Market, the business his grandfather had started back in 1963. At 42, David had taken over the store from his father 10 years ago. Under his watch, Fuller's had thrived despite competition from big chain supermarkets in neighboring towns. David believed the secret to their success wasn't their prices or their selection, it was their people. As he drove his mud-splattered pickup truck back into Pine Creek late Thursday afternoon, David was in high spirits. His cooler was full of fresh-caught trout, his mind was refreshed, and he was looking forward to getting back to the store he loved. His first hint that something was off came when he stopped for gas at the edge of town. Pete, the station owner who'd known David since they were boys, gave him an odd look. "You back from your trip now?" Pete asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just got in," David replied. "How's everything?" Pete hesitated. "You haven't heard about what happened at your store then?" David's relaxed smile faded. "What happened? Fire? Robbery?" "No, nothing like that," Pete said. "It's about Jake." By the time David pulled into the employee parking lot behind Fuller's 20 minutes later, his good mood had evaporated. Pete hadn't known all the details, just that there had been some incident with a customer being nasty to Jake, and that Jake hadn't been back to work since. David hurried through the back entrance, past surprised employees who hadn't expected him until tomorrow. "Where's Tom?" David asked Lally, who was heading to her register for the evening shift. "In the office," she answered, then added hesitantly, "Mr. Fuller, about Jake." "I'm getting the full story from Tom," David said, already moving down the hallway. He found his floor supervisor sorting through paperwork, a worried crease between his eyebrows that deepened when David appeared in the doorway. "Tell me everything," David said without preamble. For the next 15 minutes, Tom laid out the events of Saturday afternoon, Miranda's impatience, Jake's accident with the eggs, the cruel words that had silenced the store. He described how Jake had retreated to the break room, how he'd been repeating "I'm sorry" over and over, and how he hadn't returned to work since. "And who is this woman?" David asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Miranda Wells. Moved into that new development on the north side about 2 weeks ago," Tom said. "Drives a silver Lexus." David nodded slowly. "And Jake? How is he doing now?" "His mom called yesterday. Said he's talking about maybe coming back next week. The community support has helped. Have you seen the bulletin board out front?" David shook his head, and Tom led him to the store entrance. The expanded bulletin board was now covered with notes, cards, children's drawings, and photos of Jake with various customers over the years. David stood silently, reading message after message. Many were simple, "We miss you, Jake," or "Come back soon." Others were more personal. "Thank you for helping my grandmother every week. She says shopping isn't the same without you. Mike." As David read, his jaw tightened. Fuller's wasn't just a store to him, it was his family's legacy. And Jake wasn't just an employee, he was part of that legacy. "I need Jake's address," David said finally. 30 minutes later, David's truck pulled up in front of a neat one-story house with flower boxes in the windows. He sat for a moment, collecting his thoughts, before grabbing a folder from the passenger seat and walking to the door. Nancy Thompson answered on the second knock. She recognized David immediately. He made a point of knowing all his employees' families. "Mr. Fuller," she said, surprised. "We weren't expecting you." "Please, it's David," he reminded her gently. "I just got back to town and heard what happened. I'd like to speak with Jake, if that's all right." Nancy hesitated. "He's still pretty upset. He hasn't wanted to see anyone from the store yet." "I understand. But I think this is important for him and for me." Something in David's voice convinced her. Nancy nodded and led him through a cozy living room decorated with family photos. Many featured Jake in his Fuller's apron, proudly displaying various employee certificates. "Jake, honey, you have a visitor," Nancy called down the hallway. Jake appeared in his bedroom doorway, wearing sweatpants and a Pine Creek High School t-shirt. When he saw David, his eyes widened, and he unconsciously stood a little straighter. "Mr. Fuller," Jake said, his voice uncertain. "Hello, Jake," David said warmly. "I missed you at the store today. Mind if we talk for a bit?" Jake glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Ok," Jake said. "We can sit in the kitchen. Mom made cookies earlier." In the kitchen, over chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven, David Fuller did something that surprised both Jake and Nancy. He apologized. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when this happened, Jake," David said sincerely. "Fuller's is supposed to be a place where everyone is treated with respect. That woman was wrong to speak to you that way, and I want you to know that I would never allow anyone to treat my employees, my friends, like that." Jake looked down at his cookie, breaking off small pieces but not eating them. "She said people like me shouldn't work there," he said quietly. David leaned forward. "Jake, do you know why my grandfather hired the first person with Down syndrome at Fuller's? It was back in 1974. Her name was Patty Davis." Jake looked up, his interest piqued. "No, why?" "Because he said people with different perspectives see things others miss. Patty reorganized the entire inventory system in a way no one had thought of before. It saved the store thousands of dollars, and we still use a version of it today." David smiled. "You're part of a proud tradition at Fuller's, Jake." For the first time in days, Jake's face brightened slightly. David opened the folder he'd brought. "I wanted to show you something else." He pulled out a stack of printed emails. "These are messages from customers who've written to the store about you over the past 3 years. We keep them all." Jake took the papers tentatively. The top one was from Mrs. Chen, dated 6 months ago. "I want to commend your employee Jake for his exceptional help last Tuesday. I dropped my purse and spilled everything, and he not only helped me gather my belongings, but also made sure I got safely to my car afterward. You're lucky to have such a kind-hearted young man on your staff." There were dozens more. Jake read through them slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to pride. "I didn't know people wrote these," he said softly. "They did, because you matter to them. You matter to Fuller's." David paused. "And that's why I need your help with something important." Jake looked up questioningly. "I need to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else at our store," David explained. "And I think you could help me figure out the best way to do that. Would you be willing to come back and work with me on this?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he asked the question that had been haunting him. What if she comes back to the store? David Fuller's expression grew serious. "Leave that to me, Jake. I have a plan." As David drove away from the Thompson house an hour later, his fishing trip relaxation was gone, but it had been replaced by something more important: determination. David Fuller had always believed that running a business wasn't just about profits, it was about people. And tomorrow, he would make that crystal clear to everyone in Pine Creek, especially to one Miranda Wells.